What makes us like an anime? What processes occurred during the development of our opinions of said anime? And what do these processes look like at their most developed? These are the questions I have been pondering over the past few weeks, and what I would like to explore in this video. These are, of course, completely my opinion, but I have based much of this on accounts from others, and have tried to maintain a purely descriptive understanding of this process, meaning these are generalizations based on observation, and not hard and fast rules about analysis. In essence, I have observed there to be 3 fundamental stages in accurately evaluating the quality of a show. A detailed evaluation of quality is determined first through raw impressions. The first impression is important, as it's what gives you your initial baseline from which to work. This is the most fundamental stage, and the one everyone is guaranteed to experience. Everyone will have some thoughts or feelings regarding a show, even if they cannot yet articulate them. At the very least, a vague notion of whether or not you liked what you were seeing. These impressions are the result of often subconscious analysis that occurs all throughout the viewer's consumption of the show. This is ultimately what distinguishes this stage from the later ones, as later stages involve conscious thought. This stage has the largest variance in overall time spent within, ultimately depending on the person. Some people never leave this point, as some people just don't think about the shows they watch. A shame, really, but a fact of life. Others may seem to bypass it entirely, immediately possessing an articulate understanding of the work. This is simply a case of understanding impressions quickly, jumping to conscious thought about what it is they're seeing as soon as they see it. This doesn't mean they lack an initial impression, however, just that said impression is translated as soon as it's felt. The stage of impressions is fundamentally rooted in enjoyment, specifically how much you enjoy watching the show in the moment. The basis of enjoyment for a work is determined most broadly by the moment-to-moment interplay of elements. In other words, the transition from shot to shot, then from scene to scene, ultimately from episode to episode, and everything that happens in between, all serve to paint the picture in front of you. Your initial subconscious thoughts regarding whether you liked what you just saw, it's all based on the time you spend actually watching the show. So the longer you spend with the show, the closer you get to the full picture, and the closer you are to the full picture, the more accurate your assessment of quality. That being said, in most cases, every core element of a work is present from the start, and is almost always present, which is to say there is never a moment that has no tone, or no aesthetic, or no pace. This allows the viewer to make judgments even before they have finished the first episode. If, for example, the transition between shot to shot and scene to scene is particularly slow, dragging the narrative out longer than what is necessary, then one could say that the pacing was bad. But since a single aspect cannot in and of itself be bad, this is shorthand for saying the pacing contrasted with the narrative, creating dissonance, ultimately resulting in disinterest. All of this is to say, an anime is always doing something. To do nothing would be to display nothing but a black screen. Even if you do not consciously understand what the show is doing, it's still doing it. So while you're watching the show, you subconsciously pick up on most aspects of the work, and form judgments based on how well they meet your expectations. This is the first stage in quality assessment, and like I said, is where many people seem to stop. This is how you get generalized criticism with no backing, like saying a show is boring, but not being able to say why. To get to the point where you can say why, you must begin to think. Once you begin to consciously think about what the anime is doing, you enter the next stage of determination, analysis, taking every scene in context with the others to form a cohesive picture of the work as a whole, observing each aspect and their interrelationship such to induce that work of art's set of values. Understand exactly what the show is doing and what the show is saying. It's important to note that an author's intention is not necessarily what matters in this regard, though 90% of works that could be considered enjoyable are so because of careful planning and intentional design. This is not always the case. It's entirely possible for a work of art to be unintentionally good, just as many are unintentionally bad. Entire works can express values and have meaning completely opposite to the creator's intention. Because of this, it makes most sense to me to focus on the text alone during this stage. Though the creator is certainly not irrelevant, as they are the reason for the show's existence, in the end, it's not the creator's vision that determines the quality of a show. It's your own experience with the show itself. You see, art is experience. Art in a vacuum cannot exist. Art that no one experiences has no value to anybody, and thus cannot have quality, since somebody needs to experience it for them to have any thoughts about it at all, even if it's just the person who made it. Even the act of creating art is itself an experience, and even if that art is never again observed outside of the initial creation, that experience cannot be separated in the mind of the artist. Art has no objective meaning outside of the minds of those experiencing it. Art is subjective, and as a result, your analysis will be as well. Your perspective on the given text is ultimately what matters most. You own your mind, after all. People can influence that perspective by providing new information, but it still remains your perspective. The subjectivity inherent in all forms of art also means that no single set of rules induced from one show can be applied to any other to deduce that show's quality, since that set of rules may only work for one show and for one person. Instead, inductive reasoning or determining truths from observation should be applied on a case-by-case basis. When analyzing a work, you are not attempting to apply your view onto the show. You are looking at what that show in particular is doing and saying, regardless of your opinions based on what any other show might be doing. Yes, your perspective is ultimately what determines your understanding of a work, but you shouldn't try and force your perspective onto the work itself. In other words, the only rule is there are no rules. Whatever works, works, and whatever doesn't. It's your job as an analyst to figure out why. There are plenty of ways to analyze a show. I'll touch on more later, but just to name a few, some people take a more comprehensive approach and go through each scene, one after the other, and exhaustively detail every nuance a work has to offer. This is certainly admirable and gives you a detailed understanding of the show, but can be time-consuming, especially for longer shows. Generally, I tend to save this style of analysis for OVAs or movies, and generally only ones I think are interesting enough. This type of analysis is how you end up with hours-long video essays. Other forms of analysis are less direct in their approach. If you pay attention and your memory is good enough, you can induce the show's values by remembering what the show made you feel or think and what it was doing in that moment. Essentially, analyzing detailed impressions and looking broadly at how they fit together. This can get you fast results in regards to simply having an opinion on the show, but it means that opinion is ultimately less developed. This method works especially well if you're like me and you habitually overthink everything an anime is doing as you're watching it, since it just becomes about putting all those thoughts together. For any video, I will go back to the show and make sure the things I'm saying are justified and adjust my thoughts based on anything else I notice, since memory can falter. Generally, the more time you spend with the show, the more developed your analysis will be, but the broad strokes should be apparent right from the outset. Analysis is important, as you can't have an opinion on what something is doing unless you know what that is. It's much less egregious, in my opinion, to remain in this stage, since your thoughts will, at the very least, be developed, and it's my personal goal in life to get people to think. Pretentious, I know, but if your goal in watching a show is to go beyond merely understanding and to have an opinion on its quality, then you must think even further, though not by much. The final step in determining quality is evaluating the interplay of the work's elements or how well they work together. If you remember, earlier I said this is what creates the basis of enjoyment for a work in the first stage. In this stage, you are combining your initial impression with your analysis to finally be able to assign value to a work. This goes beyond simply figuring out what a show is doing. At this point, you are making an evaluation of whether or not you think it did it well. Remember, I'm speaking very broadly here. If every element comes together to create a cohesive and entertaining experience, then the work is good. If not, and the aspects create dissonance, then the work is bad. Any other nuances should be explained by your analysis. This is why I do not give scores to any work I have not finished, as you cannot properly determine a work's values without first observing everything that the artwork has on display, which is a prerequisite to determining its score. This stage tends to be quick and relatively easy. You did the grunt work during the analysis, and now it's just down to voicing your opinion. The analysis should have refined that opinion, since thinking deeply into what a work is doing is bound to change how you feel about it. It can lead to drastic changes in opinion. It's not unheard of for somebody to do a complete 180 following analysis, since you may now better appreciate everything the work has on display, or better see its every little flaw. And that's it, really. A score can now be applied in accordance to whatever rating system you may have. It's all just opinions at the end of the day. At a very simple level, we can see these three stages in the modest, though valid opinion: this show is good. I liked it for its detailed artwork. a simple opinion that anybody at any power level could hold, we can see this opinion is developed as it has passed the first impression, liking the show, analysis, understanding that the show had detailed visuals, and evaluation, determining that said visuals worked well, were the reason for enjoyment, and ultimately why the show was good. You could argue that this opinion doesn't go far enough, and you'd be right, but it's nonetheless a valid opinion that somebody could hold. Further lines of thinking only build on this. Try to look for these stages in more developed opinions. It's everywhere once you notice it. None of this is cut and dry, however. There is plenty of overlap, especially when a show is first airing. In that case, nobody has all the information, but we still see people with opinions, detailed ones at that. Even in cases when you just haven't finished a show, analysis is often unrestrained. The processes occur at both a macro level and a micro level, meaning watching a show can be a constant cycle of impression, analysis, evaluation, and so on, very quickly. I propose a slight difference in terminology to describe this phenomenon, to distinguish between working ideas and final thoughts. Preliminary analysis is the process of taking all currently available information to infer where the artwork is headed thematically and narratively. Say, will the character be punished or rewarded for the ideas that they represent? To then estimate the show's set of values using both available and inferred information in tandem. Preliminary analysis is a good way to set the groundwork for further analysis, since it allows you to begin forming a basic idea of what the work contains. The issue, however, is that because you do not have all the information available, the values expressed will not be as developed as with a finished product. So you could understand, for example, that a work puts forth life-affirming values of friendship, but you have no means of understanding the specifics of this answer. This means there is quite a bit of room for embellishment, which in the context of a video can be interesting, but should certainly be taken with a grain of salt. The other big issue with preliminary analysis is that it relies on the viewer's ability to make inferences. Since no one can see into the future, it is impossible to truly know exactly where a show might be going. This is especially true for someone new to the medium, who does not have the presupposed notions of what the medium generally is and what the medium generally does, which is why there is a common idea surrounding anime discourse that to know what you're talking about, you should have seen at least a certain number of anime. It's not so much that newcomers' opinions are worth less or that they are incapable of analysis, but rather in the climate of seasonal anime, where preliminary analysis seems to be the unspoken default, someone without proper context may not be able to accurately predict the messages and quality of a show. They have nothing to compare it to. But even to a seasoned veteran of the medium who has seen dozens or even hundreds of shows within each genre and has an acute understanding of the trappings and tropes therein, making an educated guess about where the show is headed might seem trivial, but there really is no telling where a show might go, as sudden twists can completely change the overall message of the show, and particularly unique shows, the ones that tend to be the best, don't often fall into pre-existing paradigms. Rather, they create them. They are what the future works will be compared to, but comparing them to past works may not be the most helpful. By this, I don't mean analyzing influences, which is always helpful. I mean comparing story structure and genre trappings to make predictions. Innovative shows aren't bound by this, and looking at them through that lens may do more harm than good. The main issues with preliminary analysis can be solved by analyzing the work in chunks. By looking only at what has been presented, you avoid the pitfalls of prediction. This can lead to concrete results in the way of evaluating the quality of a particular episode, but gives no insight into where the show as a whole might go. This is especially useful in the very early stages of analysis, such as when attempting to determine whether or not to drop a show. Other forms of analysis such as this are instrumental in determining your thoughts on the finished product. This is not always a completely accurate depiction of the work's interplay of elements, as they can fluctuate through a work's runtime, but they are always taken into account by the end and are therefore valid reasons for enjoyment or disinterest. Since none of the things I've talked about in this video are concrete, many of the stages of determination or forms of analysis used may occur concurrently, mostly depending on how much thought you put into it. I literally cannot stop myself from overthinking anime, both while I'm watching it and while I'm not. So these processes occur at almost all times for me, which means there is quite a bit of overlap. It's a very fluid process, and one that I'm not entirely sure is universal, but I tried to keep it as broad as possible. This video itself is the result of lots of passive thinking combined with information I've heard elsewhere, so I'm sure it's not wholly esoteric, but at the end of the day, these are just my opinions.